Theosophy and Public Opinion articles by H. P. Blavatsky on Pseudo-Theosophy. The Mote and the Beam. A Paradoxical World. Is Denunciation a Duty? H. P. Blavatsky Series No. 33. Theosophy Company, Mysore, Private Ltd. Bangalore 560,004. Objects of the Theosophical movement. I. To form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. 2. The study of ancient and modern religions, philosophies, and sciences, and the demonstration of the importance of such study. And 3. The investigation of the unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers latent in man. The articles of H. P. Blavatsky and W. Q. Judge, which originally appeared in the Theosophist, Lucifer, and the Path, were issued in pamphlet form by the Theosophy Company, Los Angeles, USA. For the benefit of students and inquirers in India, these are now being reprinted in an Indian edition. Reprint edition, 1986 by courtesy, the Theosophy Company, 245, West 33rd St., Los Angeles, California. 90007, USA. Printed by V. N. Iyer at Commercial Printing House, 41/1, 3rd Main Road, Gandhinagar, Bangalore 560,009, and published by J. M. Tijoriwala for Theosophy Company, Mysore, Private Limited, 4, Sir Krishna Rao Road, Basavangudi, Bangalore 560,004. Forward. An impressive if oblique indication of the impact of theosophical ideas on the Western world is found in the Need of H. P. Blavatsky, but 14 years after the founding of the Theosophical Society, to defend its work against ridicule, distortions, and perverting imitations while, like the Gulf Stream, strong enough in its central flow to resist the dilutions and pollutions of its surroundings. The current of theosophic influence could not help but pick up confused and alien tendencies in the shallows of human nature. Its uncompromising ethics, armed and strengthened by philosophic pantheism and the explanatory tools of karma and reincarnation, although appealing to the inner longings of mankind, also precipitated the hostilities of angered prejudice and partisan habit. The ardors of sentimental compromise were also brought to the surface, and to all these inevitable reactions of 19th-century human nature HPB was obliged to reply. The articles in this collection are editorials which appeared in Lucifer, commenting on current events both within and without the area of the theosophical movement. On pseudo-theosophy, the opening article in Lucifer for March, 1889, deals first with HPB's readiness to publish even what seemed to some satires aimed at herself, then shows that such material applies more accurately to certain individuals and groups who have stolen theosophical terms and ideas and used them to exploit susceptible followers. She writes at length of the dread karma of this perversion of occult teachings. The article concludes with an account of the strange hope of a Catholic abbé that the wise men of the East would come to Europe to reform and regenerate the Roman Church. A public protest in England against the reported cruelties of Siberian prison guards was the occasion for The Mote and the Beam, published in Lucifer for August, 1890. To show the complacent self-righteousness behind such demonstrations, HPB lists at length the crimes and injustices committed by Anglo-Saxon peoples, and largely ignored in moral criticism. Included in her account of these offenses is a comparison of the rights and treatment of women in Russia and in England, showing the far superior status of women in despotic half-civilized Russia. She then calls to mind the brutal practice of British colonials in Tasmania, who hunted down and slaughtered the natives of that island, sometimes poisoning them with arsenic, until the last of the Tasmanians died in 1872. She points out that crimes against the harmless Hindus, the blacks of other lands, and the American Indians should first have critical attention and reform from the English and the Americans. The commercial press is a familiar and deserving target of HPB in her Lucifer articles. In A Paradoxical World, February, 1889, she shows how both dailies and weeklies cater to the prejudices of the day, ignoring the light thrown on admittedly mysterious matters by the theosophical teachings. One of the better journalistic accounts of the wonders of ancient Egypt is quoted at length, after which HPB remarks, "Does not this read like a page from Isis Unveiled, or one of our theosophical writings minus their explanations?" The other side of this coin of cultural conceit is the impossibility of obtaining justice in the courts. If you are in the slightest degree unpopular, an infidel, or too radical in your views. Finally, she defends the society against the charge of profiting from its members, showing that tiny income from initiation dues and fees over a period of 10 years left a considerable deficit to be made up by HPB. And Colonel Olcott during that time. Is denunciation a duty? Lucifer, December, 1888, may have its primary importance in tracing the Western habit of condemnation of others to the psychological attitudes which result from belief in a personal God, and from the partisan loyalties which are fostered by exclusive, sectarian religion. HPB gives the rule followed by Lucifer: we denounce indignantly systems and organizations, evils, social and religious cant above all, we abstain from denouncing persons. Lucifer, March, 1889. On pseudo-theosophy: the more honesty a man has, the less he affects the air of a saint. The affectation of sanctity is a blotch on the face of devotion. Lavater: the most difficult thing in life is to know yourself. Thales: shall we winnow the corn, but feed upon the chaff? He presiding genius in the Daily News office runs amuck at Lucifer in his issue of February 16. He makes merry over the presumed distress of some theosophists who see in our serial novel, The Talking Image of Urrar by our colleague, Dr. F. Hartman, an attempt to poke fun at the Theosophical Society. Thereupon, the witty editor quizzes Madame Blavatsky for observing that she does not agree with the view taken by some pessimists, and ends by expressing fear that the misgivings that have been awakened will not easily be laid to rest. Ride, si sapes. It is precisely because it is our desire that the misgivings awakened should reach those in whom the sense of personality and conceit has not yet entirely stifled their better feelings, and force them to recognize themselves in the mirror offered to them in the talking image, that we publish the essay. Theorical novel. This proceeding of ours rather unusual, to be sure, for editors to publish a satire, which seems to the short-sighted to be aimed at their gods and parties only because they are unable to sense the underlying philosophy and moral in them, has created quite a stir in the dailies. The various metropolitan press-cutting agencies are pouring every morning on our breakfast table their load of criticism, advice, and comment upon the rather novel policy. So, for instance, a kindly disposed correspondent of the Lancashire Evening Post, February 18, writes as follows: the editor of Lucifer has done a bold thing. She is publishing a story called The Talking Image of Urrar, which is designed to satirize the false prophets of Theosophy in order that the true prophets may be justified. I appreciate the motive entirely, but, unfortunately, there are weak-minded Theosophists who can see nothing in Dr. Hartmann's spirited talk but a caricature of their whole belief. So they have remonstrated with Madame Blavatsky, and she replies in Lucifer that the story casts more just ridicule upon the enemies and detractors of the Theosophic Society than upon the few Theosophists whose enthusiasm may have carried them into extremes. Unfortunately, this is not strictly accurate. The hero of the tale, a certain Pancho, is one of these enthusiasts, and it is upon him and upon the mock adepts who deceive him that the ridicule is thrown. But it never seems to have occurred to Madame Blavatsky and Dr. Hartmann that the moment you begin to ridicule one element, even though it be a false element, in the faith, you are apt to shake the confidence of many if not most believers, for the simple reason that they have no sense of humor. The high priestess of the cult may have the sense for obvious reasons, but her disciples are likely to be lost if they begin to laugh, and if they can't laugh they will be bewildered and indignant. I offer this explanation with all humility to Madame Blavatsky, who has had some experience of the effects of satire. The more so as, according to those members of the T.S. who have read the whole story, it is precisely Madame Blavatsky against whom its satire is the most directed. And if Madame Blavatsky, presumably the talking image, does not object to finding herself represented as a kind of mediumistic poll parrot, why should other theosophists object? A theosophist above all. Men ought ever to bear in mind the advice of Epictetus: if evil be said of thee, and if it be true, correct thyself; if it be a lie, laugh at it. We welcome a witty satire always, and defy ridicule or any efforts in this direction to kill the Theosophical Society, so long as it, as a body, remains true to its original principles. As to the other dangers so kindly urged by the post, the High Priestess acknowledges the benevolent objections by answering and giving her reasons, which are these: the chosen motto of the Theosophical Society has been for years, "There is no religion higher than truth." The object of Lucifer is in the epigraph on its cover, which is to bring to light the hidden things of darkness. If the editor of Lucifer and the Theosophists would not belie one, the obvious reasons so delicately worded are these: the High Priestess of the cult is almost universally supposed, outside of the TS, to have exercised her own satirical powers and sense of humor on her alleged and numerous victims by bamboozling them into a belief of her own invention. So be it. The tree is known by its fruits, and it is posterity which will have to decide on the nature of the fruit. These two propositions, and be true to their colors, they have to deal with perfect impartiality, sparing no more themselves than outsiders, or even their enemies. As to the weak-minded Theosophists, if any, they can take care of themselves in the way they please. If the false prophets of Theosophy are to be left untouched, the true prophets will be very soon, as they have already been confused with the false. It is nigh time to winnow our corn and cast away the chaff. The TS is becoming enormous in its numbers, and if the false prophets, the pretenders, E.G., the H.B. of L, exposed in Yorkshire by Theosophists 2 years ago, and the G.N.K are just exposed in America, or even the weak-minded dupes, are left alone, then the society threatens to become very soon a fanatical body split into 300 sects like Protestantism, each hating the other, and all bent on destroying the truth by monstrous exaggerations and idiotic schemes and shams. We do not believe in allowing the presence of sham elements in Theosophy, because of the fear, forsooth, that if even a false element in the faith is ridiculed, the latter is apt to shake the confidence in the whole. At this rate Christianity would be the first to die out centuries ago under the sledgehammer blows dealt to its various churches by its many reformers. No philosopher, no mystic, or student of symbolism, can ever laugh at or disbelieve in the sublime allegory and conception of the second advent, whether in the person of Christ, Krishna, Sojish, or Buddha the cocky avatar, or last, not second, advent, to wit, the appearance of the Savior of humanity or the faith. Full light of truth, on the white horse of death. Death to falsehood, illusion, and idol, or self-worship is a universal belief. Shall we for all that abstain from denouncing the behavior of certain Second Adventists, as in America? What true Christians shall see their co-religionists making fools of themselves, or disgracing their faith, and still abstain from rebuking them publicly as privately, for fear lest this false element should throw out of Christianity the rest of the believers? Can any of them praise his co-religionists for climbing periodically, in a state of paradisiacal décolleté, on the top of their houses, trees, and high places, there to await the Advent? No doubt those who hope by stealing a march on their slower brethren to find themselves hooked up the first, and carried bodily into heaven, are as good Christians as any. Should they not be rebuked for their folly all the same? Strange logic! The wise man courts truth, the fool, flattery, however it may be. Let rather our ranks be made thinner, than the Theosophical Society go on being made a spectacle to the world through the exaggerations of some fanatics, and the attempts of various charlatans to profit by a ready-made program. These, by disfiguring and adapting occultism to their own filthy and immoral ends, bring disgrace upon the whole movement. Some writer remarked that if one would know the enemy against whom he has to guard himself the most, the looking glass will give him the best likeness of his face. This is quite true. If the first object of our society be not to study one's own self, but to find fault with all except that self, then, indeed, the T.S. is doomed to become, and it already has in certain centers, a society for mutual admiration, a fit subject for the satire of so acute an observer as we know the author of The Talking Image of Urare to be. This is our view and our policy. And be it, indeed, that I have erred, mine error remaineth with myself. That such, however, is the policy of no other paper we know of, whether a daily, a weekly, a monthly, or a quarterly, we are quite aware, but, then, they are the public organs of the masses. Each has to pander to this or that other faction of politics or society, and is doomed to howl with the wolves, whether it likes or not. But our organs, Lucifer, preeminently are, or ought to be, the phonographs, so to speak, of the Theosophical Society, a body which is placed outside and beyond all centers of forced policy. We are painfully conscious that he who tells the truth is turned out of 9 cities, that truth is unpalatable to most men, and that since men must learn to love the truth before they thoroughly believe it, the truths we utter in our magazine are often as bitter as gall to many. This cannot be helped. Were we to adopt any other kind of policy, not only Lucifer, a very humble organ of Theosophy, but the Theosophical Society itself, would soon lose all its raison d'etre and become an anomaly. But who shall sit in the seat of the scorner? Is it the timid in heart, who tremble at every opinion too boldly expressed in Lucifer, lest it should displease this faction of readers or give offense to that other class of subscribers? Is it the self-admirers, who resent every remark, however kindly expressed, if it happens to clash with their notions, or fails to show respect to their hobbies? I am Sir Oracle, and when I ope my lips, let no dog bark. Surely we learn better and profit more by criticism than by flattery, and we amend our ways more through the abuse of our enemies than the blind pandering of friends. Such satires as The Fallen Idol, and such Cellus as Nebelson, have done more good to our society, and certain of its members, than any theosophical novel, for they have shown up and touched over the foolish exaggerations of more than one enthusiast. Self-abnegation is possible only to those who have learned to know themselves, to such as will never mistake the echo of their own inner voice, that of selfish desire, to passion for the voice of divine inspiration, or an appeal from their master, nor is keelship consonant with mediumistic sensitiveness and its halloo. See nations, and therefore all the sensitives who have hitherto forced themselves into discipleship have generally made fools of themselves, and, sooner or later, thrown ridicule upon the T.S. But after the publication of The Fallen Idol, more than one such exhibition was stopped. The Talking Image of Urare may then render the same, if not better, service. If some traits in its various dramatis personae fit in some particulars certain members who still belong to the society, other characters, and the most successful of them, resemble rather certain ex-members, fanatics, in the past, bitter enemies, now conceited fools at all times. Furthermore, Puffer is a compound and very vivid photograph. It may be that of several members of the T.S., but it looks also like a deluded victim of other bogus esoteric and occult societies. One of such, just sprung up at Boston, USA, is now being nipped in the bud and exposed by our own Theosophists. These are the solar adepts spoken of in our January editorial, the aims damnus of shameful commercial enterprises. No event could vindicate the policy of our journal better than the timely exposure of these pseudo-adepts, those sages of the ages who bethought themselves of trading upon the public hunger for the marvelous ad absurdum. We did well to speak of them in the editorial as we have. It was timely and lucky for us to have pointed to the ringleaders of that shameful speculation, the sale of bogus occult knowledge. For we have averted thereby a great and new danger to the society, namely that of unscrupulous charlatans being taken for Theosophists, misled by their lies and their publi cations filled with terms from Eastern philosophy and with ideas they had bodily stolen from us only to disfigure and misapply them. The American press has already referred to them as Theosophists. Whether out of sheer flippancy, or actual malice, Some dailies have headed their sensational articles with Theosophic knaves, and Pantonymistic Theosophs, etc., etc. This is pure fiction. The editor of the Esoteric had never been at any time a member of our society, or of any of its numerous branches. Adhyapaka, alias the Hellenic Ethnomedan and Enpharon, alias the Greco-Tibetan, Ansmuverts om main Padmayahum, Sikh, was our enemy from the beginning of his career. As impudently stated by him to a reporter, we Theosophists hated him for his many virtues. Nor has the sage bent under the weight of centuries, the Vidyanika, said to be represented by a person called Eli Omart, had anything to do with the TS. The two worthies had, like two venomous wily spiders, spread their webs far and wide, and numerous are the Yankee flies caught in them. But thanks to the energy of some of our Boston members, the two hideous desecrators of Eastern philosophy are exposed. In the words of the Boston Globe, this is the weird tale which may have a sequel in court. If there are no arrests made, I shall go right on with the work, but if they make trouble, I shall stay and face the music. Hiram Erastus Butler, the esoteric philosopher of 478 Shawmut Avenue, uttered the foregoing sentiment to a Globe reporter last evening as calmly as one would make a casual remark about the weather. Thereby hangs a tale, a long, complicated, involuted, weird, mystical, scientific, hysterical tale, a tale of love and intrigue, of adventure, of alleged and to some extent of admitted swindling, of charges of a horrible and unspeakable immorality, of communion with embodied and disembodied spirits, and especially of money. In short, a tale that would make your head weary and your heart faint if you attempted to follow out all its labyrinthine details and count the cogs on its wheels within wheels. A tale that quite possibly may find its sequel in the courts, where judge, jury, and counsel will have a chance to cudgel their brains over almost every mystery in the known universe. These are the heroes whom certain timid Theosophists, those who raised their voices against the publication of the talking image of Urara, advised us to leave alone. Had it not been for that unwillingness to expose even impersonal things and deeds, our editorial would have been more explicit. Far from us be the desire to attack or expose even our enemies, so long as they harm only ourselves, personally and individually. But here the whole of the theosophical body, already so maligned, opposed, and persecuted, was endangered, and its destinies were hanging in the balance, because of that impudent pseudo-esoteric speculation. He, therefore, who maintains in the face of the Boston scandal, that we did not act rightly in tearing off the sanctimonious mask of Pecksniffian piety and the wisdom of the ages which covered the grimacing face of a most bestial immorality, of insatiable greediness for lucre and impudence, fire, water, and police. Proof is no true Theosophist. How minds, even of an average intelligence, could be caught by such transparent snares as these publicly exhibited by the two worthies, to wit, Adhyapaka and Vidyanika, traced by the American press to one Hiram Butler and Eli Omart, passes all comprehension. Suffice to read the pamphlet issued by the two confederates, to see at the first glance that it was a mere repetition, more enlarged and barefaced, and with a wider, bolder program, still a repetition of the now defunct H.B. of L with its mysterious appeals of 4 years ago to the dissatisfied with the Theosophical Mahatmas. The 200 pages of the wildest balderdash constitute their appeal from the unseen and the unknown and the interior of the inmost, to the awakened. Pantonymus and Ekpharon offer to teach the unwary the laws of ends, movens, and om, and appeal for money. Vidyanika and Ethnomedan propose to initiate the ignorant into the a priori sambadistic philosophy of Kapila and beg for hard cash. The story is so sickening that we dislike to stain our pages with its details. But now to the moral of the fable. Yes, spurned the substance and have clutched the shadow for 14 years, our Theosophical Society has been before the public. Born with the threefold object of infusing a little more mutual brotherly feeling in mankind, of investigating the mysteries of nature from the spiritual and psychic aspect, and, of doing a tardy justice to the civilizations and wisdom of Eastern Christian nations and literature, if it did not do all the good that a richer society might, it certainly did no harm. It appealed only to those who found no help for their perplexities anywhere else. To those lost in the psychic riddles of spiritualism, or such, again, as, unable to stand the morbid atmosphere of modern unbelief, and seeking light in vain from the unfathomable mysteries taught by the theology of the 1001 Christian sects, had given up all hope of solving any of the problems of life. There was no entrance fee during the first 2 years of the Society's existence. Afterwards, when the correspondence and postage alone demanded hundreds of pounds a year, new members had to pay £1 for their diploma. Unless one wanted to support the movement, one could remain a fellow all his life without being asked for a penny, and 2/3 of our members have never put their hand in their pocket, nor were they asked to do so. Those who supported the cause were from the first a few devoted Theosophists who labored without conditions or any hope for reward. Yet no association was more insulted and laughed at than was the Theosophical Society. No members of any body were spoken of in more contemptuous terms than the fellows of the TS from the first. The Society was born in America, and therefore it was regarded in England with disfavor and suspicion. We were considered as fools and knaves, victims and frauds before the benevolent interference of the Psychic Research Society, which tried to build its reputation on the downfall of Theosophy and spiritualism, but really harmed neither. Nevertheless, when our enemies got the upper hand, and by dint of slander and inventions had most maliciously succeeded in placing before the credulous public, ever hungry for scandals and sensations, mere conjectures as undeniable and proven facts, it was the American press which became the most bitter in its denunciations of Theosophy, and the American public the most willing to drink in and giggle over the undeserved calumnies upon the founders of the TS. Yet it is they who were the first told, through our society, of the actual existence of Eastern adepts in occult sciences. But both the English and the Americans spurned and scoffed at the very idea, while even the spiritualists and mystics, who ought to have known better, would, with a few exceptions, have nothing to do with heathen masters of wisdom. The latter were, they maintained, invented by the Theosophists. It was all moonshine. For these masters, whom no member was ever asked to accept, unless he liked to do so himself, on whose behalf no supernatural claim was ever made, unless, perhaps, in the too ardent imagination of enthusiasts, these masters who gave to, and often helped with money, poor Theosophists, but never asked anything of the rich. These masters were too much like real men. They neither claimed to be gods nor spirits, nor did they pander to people's gush and sentimental creeds. And now those Americans have got at last what their hearts yearned for, a bona fide ideal of an adept and magician. A creature several thousand years old. A true blue Buddhist Brahmin who appeals to Jehovah, or Yahweh, speaks of Christ and the Messianic cycle, and blesses them with an Amen and an Om Mani Padme Hum in the same breath, relieving them at the same time of $40,000 before they are a month old in their worship of him. Walali. Allah is great and Vidyanika is his only prophet. Indeed, we feel little pity for the victims. What is the psychology that some Theosophists are accused of exercising over their victims in comparison with this? And this necessitates a few words of explanation. Ignorance not altogether bliss. All know that there is a tacit, often openly expressed, belief among a few of the fellows of the TS that a certain prominent Theosophist among the leaders of the society psychologizes all those who happen to come within the area of that individual's influence. Dozens, nay, hundreds, were, and still are, psychologized. The hypnotic effect seems so strong as to virtually transform all such unfortunates into irresponsible nincompoops, mere ciphers and tools of that theosophical Circe. This idiotic belief was originally started by some wise men of the West. Unwilling to admit that the said person had either any knowledge or powers, bent on discrediting their victim, and yet unable to explain certain abnormal occurrences, they hit upon this happy and logical loophole to get out of their difficulties. The theory found a grateful and fruitful soil. Henceforth, whenever any fellows connected theosophically with the said psychologizer happen to disagree in their views upon questions, metaphysical or even purely administrative, with some other member on despotism bent, forthwith the latter comes out with the favorite solution: oh, they are psychologized, the magic word springs out on the arena of discussion like a jack in a box, and forthwith the attitude of the rebels is explained and plausibly accounted for. Of course, the alleged psychology has really no existence outside the imagination of those who are too vain to allow any opposition to their all-wise and autocratic decrees on any other ground than phenomenal, nay, magical interference with their will. A short analysis of the karmic effects that would be produced by the exercise of such powers may prove interesting to theosophists. Even on the terrestrial, purely physical plane, moral irresponsibility ensures impunity. Parents are answerable for their children, tutors and guardians for their pupils and wards, and even the Supreme Courts have admitted extenuating circumstances for criminals who are proved to have been led to crime by a will or influences stronger than their own. How much more forcibly this law of simple retributive justice must act on the psychic plane. And what, therefore, may be the responsibility incurred by using such psychological powers, in the face of karma and its punitive laws, may be easily inferred. Is it not evident that, if even human justice recognizes the impossibility of punishing an irrational idiot, a child, a minor, etc., taking into account even hereditary causes and bad family influences, that the divine law of retribution, which we call karma, must visit with hundredfold severity one who deprives reasonable, thinking men of their free will and powers of ratiocination? From the occult standpoint, the charge is simply one of black magic, of envoudement. Alone a Dugpa, with Avicii yawning at the further end of his life cycle, could risk such a thing. Have those so prompt to hurl the charge at the head of persons in their way, ever understood the whole terrible meaning implied in the accusation? We doubt it. No occultist, no intelligent student of the mysterious laws of the night side of nature, no one who knows anything of karma, would ever suggest such an explanation. What adept or even a moderately informed Kila would ever risk an endless future by interfering with, and therefore taking upon himself, the karmic debit of all those whom he would so psychologize as to make of them merely the tools of his own sweet will? This fact seems so evident and palpably flagrant, that it is absurd to have to recall it to those who boast of knowing all about karma. Is it not enough to bear the burden of the knowledge that from birth to death, the least, the most unimportant, unit of the human family exercises an influence over, and receives in his turn, as unconsciously as he breathes, that of every other unit whom he approaches, or who comes in contact with him? Each of us either adds to or diminishes the sum total of human happiness and human misery, not only of the present, but of every subsequent age of humanity, as shown so ably by Elihu Burritt, who says, "There is no sequestered spot in the universe, no dark niche along the disk of non-existence, from which he, man, can retreat from his relations to others, where he can withdraw the influence of his existence upon the moral destiny of the world. Everywhere his presence or absence will be felt, everywhere he will have companions who will be better or worse for his influence." It is an old saying, and one of fearful and fathoming import, that we are forming characters for eternity. Forming characters. Whose? Our own or others? Both, and in that momentous fact lies the peril and responsibility of our existence. Who is sufficient for the thought? Thousands of my fellow beings will yearly enter eternity with characters differing from those they would have carried thither had I never lived. The sunlight of that world will reveal my finger marks in their primary formations, and in their successive strata of thought and life. These are the words of a profound thinker. And if the simple fact of our living changes the sum of human will and woe in a way for which we are, owing to our ignorance, entirely irresponsible, what must be the karmic decree in the matter of influencing hundreds of people by an act perpetrated and carried on for years, in premeditation and the full consciousness of what we are doing? Verily, the man or woman in the unconscious possession of such dangerous powers had much better never be born. The occultist who exercises them consciously will be caught up by the whirlwind of successive rebirths, without even an hour of rest. Woe to him, then, in that ceaseless, dreary series of terrestrial avocies, in that interminable aeon of torture, suffering, and despair, during which, like the squirrel doomed to turn the wheel at every motion, he will launch from one life of misery into another, only to awake each time with a fresh burden of other people's karma which he will have drawn upon himself. Is it not enough, indeed, to be regarded as frauds, cranks, and infidels, by the outsiders, without being identified with wizards and witches by our own members? To Deva-chan, rather, the entr'acte between two incarnations. The genus infidel and its varieties. It is true to say that the varieties of infidels are many, and that one infidel differs from another infidel as a Danish boarhound differs from the street mongrel. A man may be the most heterodox infidel with regard to orthodox dogmas. Yet, provided he proclaims himself loudly a Christian, that heterodoxy, when even going to the length of saying that revealed religion is an imposture, will be regarded by some as simply of that exalted kind which rises above all human forms. A Christian of such a kind may, as the late Lawrence Oliphant has given vent to a still more startling theory. He may affirm that he considers that from time to time the divine influence emanates itself, so to speak, in phenomenal persons. Sakvamuni was such, Christ was such, and such I consider Mr. Like Harris to be. In fact, he is a new avatar, for and still remain a Christian of an exalted kind in the sight of the upper ten. But let an infidel of the Theosophical Society say just the same, minus the absurdity of including the American Lake Harris in the list of the avatars, and no contumely heaped upon him by clergy and servile newspapers will ever be found too strong. But this belongs properly to the paradoxes of the age, though the avataric idea has much to do with karma and rebirth, and that belief in reincarnation has nothing in it that can militate against the teachings of Christ. We affirm, furthermore, that the great Nazarene adept distinctly taught it. So did Paul and the Synoptics, and nearly all the earliest church fathers, with scarcely an exception, accepted it, while some actually taught the doctrine. Do not start two hairs at once from the sublime to the ridiculous. There is but one step, and karma acts along every line, on nations as on men. The Japanese Mikado is tottering towards his end for having played too long at hide and seek with his worshippers. Hundreds of shrewd Americans have been taken in through disbelieving in truths and lending a too credulous ear to bold lies. A French abbé has fallen under karmic penalty for coquetting too openly with Theosophy, and 3 vide Lady Grant Duff's article Lawrence Oliphant in the Contemporary Review for February, pages 185 and 188. 4 Ibid quoted from Sir Thomas Wade's Notes, by Lady Grant Duff, page 186. Attempted to mirror himself, like a modern clerical Narcissus, in the too deep waters of Eastern occultism. The Abbé Roca, an honorary chanoine, canon, in the Diocese of Perpignan, our old friend and irrepressible adversary in the French Lotus a year ago, has come to grief. Yet his ambition was quite an innocent one, if rather difficult of realization. It was founded on a dream of his, a reconciliation between pantheistic Theosophy and a socialistic Latin Church, with a fancy pope at the head of it. He longed to see the masters of wisdom of old India and Eastern occultism under the sway of Rome regenerated, and amused himself with predicting the same. Hence a frantic race between his meridional fantasy and the clerical bent of his thought. Poor eloquent Abbé! Did he not already perceive the kingdom of heaven in the new Rome Jerusalem? A new pontiff seated on a throne made out of the cranium of Macroprosopis, with the Zohar in his right pocket, Chakma, the male Sephiroth, transformed by the good Abbé into the Mother of God, in his left, and a lamb stuffed with dynamite, in the paternal popish embrace. The wise men of the East were even now, he said, crossing the Himalayas, and, led by the star of Theosophy, would soon be worshipping at the shrine of the reformed Pope and Lamb. It was a glorious dream, alas, still but a dream. But he persisted in calling us the greatest of Christian Buddhists. Lotus, February 1888, unfortunately for himself he also called the Pope of the Caesaro-Papal Rome the Satan of the Seven Hills in the same number. Result, Pope Leo XIII asserts once more the proverbial ingratitude of theological Rome. He has just deprived our poetical and eloquent friend and adversary, the Abbé Rocca, of the exercise of all his functions in holy orders, as also of his living for refusing to submit to a decree by which his works were placed on the Index Expurgatorius. These works bore the titles of Christ, the Pope, and the Democracy, the Fatal Crisis and the Salvation of Europe, and the End of the World. Even in the face of the present papal decision, he is advertising the appearance of a fourth work, entitled Gloriae Centenaire, 1889. Monde Nouveau. Nouveau Cieux, Nouvelle Terre. According to Galignani, and his own articles and letters in Theosophical Organs, we may add, the fearless Abbé has for some time, says Galignani, been denouncing the papacy as a creature of Caesar, and as wholly preoccupied with the question of its temporalities in face of the crying needs of humanity. According to his view, the divine aid was promised the Church until the end of the world, or of the age, and the Caesarian age having passed away, all things are to be made new. He looks forward to a spiritual coming of Christ by the spread of the modern sentiment of liberty, equality, fraternity, toleration, solidarity, and mutuality, in the atmosphere of the gospel. Although his views do not appear to be very clear, he argues that the gospel is passing from the mystico-sentimental phase to the organico-social phase, thanks to the progress of science, which will illumine everything. The globe. This is only what had to be expected. The Abbé would not accept our joint warnings and took no heed of them. The sad epilogue of our polemics is given, not altogether correctly as regards the present writer, in the same globe, wherein the news is wound up in the following words: he has been contending, in the Lotus, in favor of a union of the East and the West by means of a fusion between Buddhism and the Christian gospel, but me. Blavatsky, the foremost European convert to the Indian religion, has emphatically repudiated all attempts at such union, because she cannot or will not accept the authority of Christ. The Abbé Rocca is therefore left out in the cold. This is not so. What me? Blavatsky replied in the Lotus December 1887, to the Abbé's assertions that the said fusion between his church and Theosophy would surely come, was this: we are not as optimistic as he, the Abbé Rocca, is. His church sees in vain her greatest mysteries unmasked and the fact proclaimed in every country by scholars versed in Orientalism and symbology as by Theosophists, and we refuse to believe that she will ever accept our truths or confess her errors. And as, on the other hand, no true Theosophist will accept any more a carnalist Christ according to the Latin dogmas than an anthropomorphic God, and still less a pastor in the person of a pope, it is not the adepts who will ever go toward the Mount of Salvation, as in Vite by the Abbé, they will rather wait that the Muhammad of Rome should go to the trouble of taking the path which leads to Mount Meru. This is not rejecting the authority of Christ if the latter be regarded as we and Lawrence Oliphant regarded him, i.e., as an avatar like Gautama Buddha and other great adepts who became the vehicles or reincarnations of the one divine influence. What most of us will never accept is the anthropomorphized Charmant Doctor of Renat, or the Christ of Torquemada and Calvin rolled into one. Jesus, the adept we believe in, taught our Eastern doctrines, karma and reincarnation foremost of all. When the so-called Christians will have learned to read the New Testament between the lines, their eyes will be opened and they will see. We propose to deal with the subject of karma and reincarnation in our next issue. Meanwhile, we are happy to see that a fair wind is blowing over Christendom and propels European thought more and more eastward. Lucifer, August, 1890. The mote and the beam, ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Matthew 7:0. The virtuous indignation, the roaring tempest raised in The tender souls of American and British philanthropists at the rumor that Russian authorities in Siberia are not as tender as they should be towards their political prisoners. What a hullabaloo of loud protests, of indignation meetings, of gigantic gatherings to denounce their neighbors, while they keep prudently silent about the same misdeeds at home. A monster meeting of some 250,000 men protested the other day at Hyde Park in the name of civilization and humanity against the brutal behavior of some unknown Russian officials and jailers. Now, one can readily understand and entirely appreciate the feelings of the masses, of the oppressed, the suffering poor and the hoi polloi in general. These being sat upon from birth to death by the high and the wealthy of their own land, and having all, to a man, many a sore place in their hearts, must feel them vibrating with pain and sympathy with their brothers in sorrow of other countries. True, the energy expended at the said meeting might have been more usefully directed, perhaps, against local and colonial Siberias and dead houses, but such as it was, the impulse being genuine, every Theosophist regarded it with respect. But that to which every member of the Theosophical Society ought to refuse that feeling of sympathy is the hypocritical cant in this matter of sundry editors who remain dumb in face of misdeeds at home, pouring all their wrath on the abuse of power and the brutality of Russian officers. This is enough to make an owl laugh in full daylight. That charges of cruelty should be brought forward, and leprous spots singled out on the body of Russia by England and America is a sufficiently curious piece of moral audacity, but that this attitude should be supported, and even enforced, by certain editors, instead of being passed over in prudent silence, makes one think of the wise adage, whom the gods would destroy they first make mad. To the student of human nature a world of instruction is contained therein, and he feels thankful for this additional experience. Bearing in mind that Lucifer has not to do with the political situation in all this affair, let the reader remember, that it has, on the other hand, everything toto with its moral aspect. Having its mission at heart, to wit, to bring to light the hidden things of darkness, it has naturally a good deal to say about drunken John and drunken Jonathan nodding so frowningly at drunken Peter, and so gravely moralizing at him as though they were themselves sinless. Here the writer speaks first of all as a Theosophist, and only secondly as a Russian, neither excusing Russia, nor accusing England and America, but simply throwing the full glare of the torch of truth on facts which no one can deny. And once this position established, the writer says, how consoling and hopeful might have been for our growing society that of the universal brotherhood of man such exhibition of the noblest and most human feelings, had it not been marred by a few antecedent facts, of which presently. Even as the protest against Russian cruelty stands now, all such show of pious regard for Christ's command, move your enemies, is spoiled by a disregard of that other injunction, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are. Indeed, Europe might be asking now, as of George Dandin in the comedy of Molière, qui de nous du trompe en ici? Could even a child be really deceived by such protests on the continent? If all this display of indignation is likely to impress anyone eventually, it will be only those inferior races under the paternal sway and benevolent rule of their respective white rulers. Hindus and Mussulman, Burmese and Sinhalese, upon listening to the reverberating echoes of pious horror from the West, are as likely as not to contrast the ferociousness of Russian jailers and prison houses with that of their own rulers, with the Calcutta black hole of famous memory, and the Andaman Islands, while the hapless and ever-kicked Negroes of the United States, the Red Indians dying of exposure and starvation in their frozen wilderness, and even some Chinamen who seek hospitality on the Pacific coast, may yet come to envy the lot of the political prisoners of Siberia. But what imposing pictures! On the other side of the pond, the pathetic eloquence of Mr. George Knan, the Siberian traveler, who has just seen all this for himself, you see. Drawing tears from the street flags and forcing lamp-posts to use their pocket handkerchiefs, without speaking of the colored citizens, Red Indians, and Chinamen. On this side of the Atlantic, Mr. Quilter, the editor of the Universal Review, showing like fervor on behalf of the oppressed. Mr. Adolph Smith's exile by administrative order, adorned by what Mr. Stead calls a fancy sketch of the flogging of Madame Sahida. Moved by a spirit of lofty chivalry, its editor issued, as all know, a circular to M.P.S., peers, judges, heads of colleges and so on, to ask them whether, j. the present system of Siberian exile by administrative order was not a disgrace to a civilized nation, and, b. whether the above-mentioned authorities do not consider that steps should be taken to call the attention of Her Majesty's government to those outrages, in order that a diplomatic remonstrance should be addressed to the Tsar. As this pertains to the domain of politics, and we do not care to trespass upon forbidden ground, those anxious to learn something of the replies are recommended to read the excellent summary of this curious incident on page 489 of the June Review of Reviews, but we must quote a few lines from it, in which the reader will learn, 1. That some of the authorities appealed to are of opinion that exile in Siberia is a just and beneficent punishment much better for criminals than our own, British, convict system. 2. That the outrage on Madame Sihida does not rest upon unimpeachable evidence, the sketch recalling to the writer's memory an equally dramatic picture of a Polish prince chained in a convict gang to a murderer, a story which this prince's brother subsequently declared was false. But that which cannot be disproved by any means is that other and far more legitimate agitation going on in England for long years, and now at its acme in this country, that for the enfranchisement of women, and the causes which made it arise. Most one were this flogging even proven, which it is not still brutal and sickening as the fact would undeniably be. Is it really any worse than the kicking by the police of women already knocked down by them, than the clubbing until mangled to death of men and crippled boys? And if one is reminded that the alleged flogging took place, if it ever did, in the wilds of Siberia, probably hundreds of miles away from any civilized center, to speak of, and the well-proven kicking and clubbing right in the midst of the most civilized city in the world, namely, in Trafalgar Square, it does seem as if it were a case of merely 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Theosophists have read Mrs. F. Fenwick Miller's admirable address on the program of the Women's Franchise League, and many of our Theosophists belong to this league. And there are such as have declared that many women in England even now, when many of the women's disabilities so-called, have been happily removed after centuries of penal servitude to their husbands, would gladly have consented to exchange places with Madame Sihida, whoever she is, not as a political prisoner, perhaps, but as a flogged woman. What is the horror of being flogged? Where brutal force is used, there is no dishonor but martyrdom, when compared with a long life of moral and physical slavery. Which of the female serfs of sex 8 in free England would not gladly exchange her position as a wife and mother, for that of a wife and mother in despotic Russia? Why, ladies and gentlemen, who have fought in the married women's property agitation, for the custody of infants bill, and the right of woman as an independent individual and a citizen, instead of the thing and her husband's chattel that she was and still is, are you aware that in despotic half-civilized Russia, the rights of women before the law are on a par with those of men, and in some cases their privileges far greater? That a rich woman marrying a man is, and has been, since the days of Catherine II, sole mistress of her property, the husband having no right to 1 penny without the wife's legal signature. That a poor girl, marrying a rich man, having on the other hand a legal right to his property during his life and to a certain portion after his death whether he wills it or not, and also a right to the maintenance of herself and children, whatever she does. 1. Have you not heard that a woman holding property and paying taxes is obliged to give her vote, whether personally or by proxy? And that so greatly is she protected by law that even a child born between 9 and 10 months after the husband's death is considered legitimate by IA simply because abnormally prolonged gestation does casually happen, and that the law states that it is more consonant with the law of Christ to forgive 9 guilty women, rather than wrong the 10th who may be innocent. Compare this with the laws of free England with regard to woman, who until about 8 or 9 years ago was 2. The National Liberal Club, February 25, 1890. 3. Woman's rights as preached by women by a looker-on. 4. If separated, not divorced, and the husband is a public official, a certain portion is deducted from his salary and paid over to the wife. Simply a slave, with less rights than a plantation Negro. Read again Mrs. Fenwick Miller's paper, LOCCIT Supra, and judge. Everything went against her receiving a higher education, inasmuch as she was to remain all her life under the tutelage of some man. She had no right to her husband's property, and lost every right to hers, even to every penny she earned by her own labor, having, in short, no right to hold any property, whether inherited or acquired. A man deserting his wife for another woman, and leaving her and his children to starve, was not forced to support them, but had a legal right to every penny earned by his abandoned wife, as the skill of her brain was not hers, it was her husband's. No matter what he did, or whatever crime he committed against her, she had no redress against him, could neither sue him, nor had even the right of lodging a complaint against him. More, she had no rights as a mother, English law recognizing only the father and the child. Her children could be taken away from her, separated from their mother forever, and there was no redress for her. Says Mrs. Fenwick Miller, the wife had in the eyes of the law simply no existence. Even within the last 2 years, 7 judges in conclave have declared the law to be today that a married woman is in this respect still absolutely a slave, with no rights of free will in herself. Was this not slavery? The woes and flight of the mulatto mother invented by Mrs. Stowe's genius set all England weeping, but English and Scotch mothers, 2 refined women, adoring mothers, have seen their children torn from their embrace or have fled secretly and lived in desolate concealment with their little ones, as the only way to keep near their breaking hearts the darlings of their souls. Herbert Spencer seems to have said the same long ago, in these words: wives in England were bought from the 5th to the 11th century, and as late as the 17th century husbands of decent station were not ashamed to beat their wives. Gentlemen arranged parties of pleasure for the purpose of seeing wretched women whipped at Bridewell. It was not till 1817 that the public whipping of women was abolished in England. Between 1817 and 1890 there are but a few years. But how many centuries old is English civilization as compared to that of Russia, whose era of barbarism closed only with Peter the Great? Who, then, except men capable of taking such undue if legal advantage of their mothers, wives, and children, would not confess that there is far less cruelty even in the casual flogging of a woman than in such a systematic oppression, the lifelong torture of millions of innocent women and mothers throughout past centuries and to the present day? And for what reasons? Simply to protect the animal passions and lust, the depravity of men, the masters and the legislators. And it is the men of England who have refused, till forced in their last retrenchments, to abrogate such fiendish laws, and who still refuse to make away with many more as iniquitous, who call this solitary case of flogging a disgrace to civilization. And so it would be, if once proved, as are the heartless laws of England against her women. No doubt that of drunken, and therefore cruel, brutes among Russian jailers and prison officials there are plenty. But we trow no more than there are in other countries, and probably less. And we would advise the editors who would agitate in favor of sending remonstrances to Russia, to first extract the beam from the eye of their own country and then only to turn their attention to the mote in the eye of their neighbor. For that neighbor is a country which protects at any rate her mothers and wives, while England lets her laws treat them simply as the goods and chattels of her men, and treats them as the dumb brutes of creation. If there ever was a real disgrace to a civilized nation, it was the formation of numberless societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, before anyone even thought of establishing a like society for the protection of women and children, and the punishment of wife-kickers and wife-robbing rascally bipeds, such as are found in every class of society. And why not rather turn the public attention to more than one disgrace to a civilized nation, taking place on British soil and in American lands, e.g., to the revolting treatment by the Anglo-Indians of the millions of natives, from the highest Brahmin to the lowest pariah, and the no less revolting attitude of the white Americans towards their black CO citizens, or the hapless Redondians. Cannibals inflict less torture on their prisoners of war than do the two cultured Christian nations in question on their colored brethren of the inferior races. The former kill and devour their victims, after which these are at rest, while the whites of England and America act worse than Cains towards their black subjects and citizens. They torture them mentally, when not physically, from their cradle to their tomb, refusing them every privilege they have a right to, and then turning round and spitting on them as if they were so many toads. Look at the unfortunate red skin. Deprived of every inch of his ancestral land, crowded off into the sea, robbed of his supply of blankets and provisions, the Indian is left to freeze and starve by hundreds and thousands, which he proceeds to do amidst catacombs of Bibles, a prey unfit even for the prairie buzzard. But why go so far as to the colonies for our instances and proofs, when cases of repeated flogging of women, of young girls not out of their teens, necessitate royal commissions at home? Ruby, or How Girls Are Trained for Circus Life, by Amy Reed, a shocker founded on facts as the author claims, has brought forth the following in the Saturday Review, July 26, 1890 Royal Commission. Mr. Gainsford Bruce, QC, MP, has promised that as soon as sufficient evidence be obtained to justify such a step, he will call attention to the matter in the House of Commons, with a view of inducing the government to advise Her Majesty to appoint a royal commission to inquire into and report upon the treatment of children whilst being trained to the business of circus riders, acrobats, and contortionists. Manchester Guardian says, Ruby, by Amy Reed. This book is notable on account of the charges brought by the authoress against a manager or managers in general of circuses. It is an indictment so tremendous that, if it can be proved, the authoress should not be content with representing a picture to harrow novel readers. She should collect her proofs and lay them before the public prosecutor. Miss Reed asserts that in cases of contumacy girls of 17 are stripped naked by the circus master and flogged by him till they are sick and faint and bleeding among the members of Parliament who have allowed their names to be used as indication of their desire to assist the author. In her efforts to bring before the public the horrible cruelties, are Messrs. Gainsford Bruce, Jacob Bright, Sir Richard Temple, etc., etc. Now, Madame Sihida, whatever she was else, was a murderess, political or not does not matter, but these unfortunate girls of 17 are perfectly innocent victims. Gentlemen editors, of the two cultured champion nations of Christendom, you may play as much as you like at Sir Charles Grandison, that union of the perfect gentleman and good Christian, but who will believe you? Your protests are only suggestive of the Christian ethics of today, and are an insult to the ethics of Christ. They are no better than a glaring instance of modern cant, and a gigantic apotheosis of hypocrisy. In the words of Lemontov, the Russian poet, all this comedy would be too grotesque, in truth, if it were not so heartrending. Read rather Bertillon's Les Races Sauvages and Charles Lumholtz's Au Pays des Cannibals, a French translation from the Swedish, if you would know what your friends accuse you of, while Russia is charged with her misdeeds only by her enemies, and those jealous of her growing power. Having just come across some reviews of these works, it is but right that our friends should have an idea of the charges published against England, or rather her colonies, and thus be given the means of comparing the Russian mote with the British beam. We were just preparing to blush for the alleged misdeeds of the former, which misdeeds, if true, would not be excused by any theosophist on the ground that the Anglo-Indians and the Americans do far worse at home as well as in their colonies, when we saw a Russian review of these works which made us long to read the works themselves. We had known for years that which the whole world knows, in what a civilized and Christian way the English and the Americans treated not their prisoners, political or others, but simply their most loyal subjects and citizens, harmless Hindus and other black heathens, hard-working, honest Negroes, and the much wronged Red Indians. But we were not prepared to believe that which is published in the Races Sauvages of Bertillon and Au Pays des Cannibals by the well-known Swedish traveller in Australia, Charles Lumholtz. Let us glance at the older work. Bertillon speaks of Tasmania, and shows that in 1803 there were still about 6,000 natives left, while just 69 years later there remained of them but a legend, and a ghastly tale. In 1872 died the last of the Tasmanians. The country was swept out of its last nigger. How did it come to pass? This is Bertillon's tale. To achieve such a brilliant result, the English did not stop before any kind of cruelty. They premised by offering £5 for the head of every adult, and £2 for that of every baby Tasmanian. To succeed in this chase after the miserable native the better, the English brought with them aborigines of Australia, the great enemies of the Tasmanians, and used them as blood hounds. But this method was found to work too slowly. Then a cordon was organized, or rather a band, selected from colonists, and among the scum of the garrison. And Arthur, the then governor of the island, was appointed as its chief. After this commenced a regular chase after the Tasmanian, as one finds in hunts after wild boars. The natives were driven into deep water, shot, as if by accident, and those who escaped were poisoned with arsenic. Some colonists going so far as to make a fine collection of their victims' skulls, and boasting of it. Now this may, or may not, be true. It may, or may not, be exaggerated, just as in the case of Siberian flogging and cruelty to political prisoners. As the latter charge comes to us from Russia's enemies and sensation-loving travelers, so the tale of Tasmania is told by the same kind of traveler, and, moreover, one of a nation not generally friendly to England. But here comes something more modern and trustworthy, a charge from a decided friend of England and the Australians, and one who says what he has seen with his own eyes, heard with his own ears, namely, Charles Lumholtz, in his work called in the French translation, Au Pays des Cannibals. We quote from an ample Russian review of the work, in the Novny Vremya, May 2, 1890, number 5080. According to the latter, the enlightenment of the inferior races and the savage Icelanders by the civilization-spreading Englishmen did not stop at the Tasmanians. This is from Lumholtz's revelation, and it is ghastly. There is a chapter in this work treating specially of the relations of the English colonists with the natives, and what deadly terrible relations. The life of a black man is worth nothing, it seems, and his rights to existence are on a par with those of a wild beast. To kill a native of Australia is the same as killing a dog in the eyes of a British colonist, says Lumholtz. More than this, no dog will be so cruelly treated in Europe. Its life, unless dangerous to men, will not be taken away without any cause. Not so for the native of Australia, according to the evidence of the Swedish author, who shows that there are young men who make a point of hunting the blacks every Sunday in the neighborhood of their cities, systematically passing the whole day in that sport, simply for pleasure's sake. A party of 4 or 5 horsemen prepares traps, or, driving the savages into a narrow pass, forces them to seek refuge on precipitous cliffs, and while the unfortunate wretches are climbing at their life's peril on almost perpendicular bare rocks, one ball after another is fired at them, making even those slightly wounded to lose their hold, and falling down, break and tear themselves into shreds on the sharp rocky projections below. A squatter in Long Lagoon has become famous for the immense number of blacks he has poisoned with strychnine. And this is no single instance. A farmer from Lower Herbert confessed to the Swedish traveler that he was in the habit of burning the dead bodies of the natives to get rid of them, in order to destroy a too palpable piece of evidence. But this was only an extra precaution. For, although local law, on paper, punishes murder, it is in reality only the killing of white men which is called murder. English colonists have repeatedly offered to Lumholtz to shoot a few blacks, to get for him the native skulls he was in need of. Before law a black savage is entirely helpless. Were one a native, I would kill every English colonist I met, said an exasperated Englishman, an eyewitness like himself, to our author. Another traveler, in his letter to Lumholtz, speaks of these British colonists as of the most disgusting caricatures of Christians, and adds, the English constantly throw stones at other nations for their behavior to conquered races, while no words can express the horror and the indignity of their own acts towards the natives of Australia. Thus, having swept off the face of the earth the unfortunate Tasmanians, the British colonists, with a cruelty a tiger might envy, destroy to this day the Australian savages. When the first colony of the province of Victoria was founded, there were about 10,000 natives in that district. In 1871, their number fell to 3,000, and in 1880 there were only about 800 left, in all. How many remain alive now we do not know. At any rate, the above-cited figures show very eloquently that the civilizing influence of the enlightened mariners has borne fruit and their handiwork is nearing its end. A few more years, says Lumholtz, and the Australian Aboriginal race will have disappeared from the face of the earth. The English province of Victoria, raised on the black man's lands, soaked through and through with his savage blood and fertilized with his bones, will blossom the more luxuriously for that. The Russian reviewer ends with a paragraph which may be taken as a lit for tat to the English editor of the Universal Review and his colleagues. We give a verbatim translation of it: such is the soil on which that colonizing activity the English seem so proud of finds its vent. And it is this soil, furrowed in length and breadth by the brutal cruelty of the soulless English colonist, which proclaims loudly to the whole world that, to have right of throwing stones at other nations, it is not sufficient yet to be covered with an English skin. It is also necessary that the British soul should not be as black as are the bodies of, and the soil wrenched from, the poor natives, and that the hapless savages should not be viewed by their conscience as no better than the Egyptian mummies of cats, to wit, good only to serve as land fertilizers for their masters' flourishing colonies. And now we have done, leaving the detractors and self-constituted judges of Russia to their own reflections. We have lived in India and throughout Asiatic countries, and, as a Theosophist, we feel bound to say that nowhere have we found such a potentiality of cruelty and cant under the brown and black skins as under the white epiderm of the refined European, save perhaps, in the class of the Gariwalas, the bullock cart drivers. If the reader would learn the characteristics of this class, he will be told for his edification what is that personage. The Gariwala belongs to that specimen of humanity to which speech was given to conceal its thought, and which professes its religion only because it serves its ends. While offering divine honors and worship to the cow and the bull, and never letting any opportunity of denouncing his brother Gariwala to the village Brahmin for disrespect to the sacred animals, he himself twists the tails of his team of oxen until these appendages of his gods hang only by a few hairs and clotted blood. The Gariwala, it is, then, who ought to feel a legitimate pride in finding himself acting on the same lines of whining cant as his masters the Barasabs. And coming so near, in his own humble way, to the policy of the two most civilized and cultured nations of Christendom, the Gariwala ought perhaps to be promoted from the ranks of the inferior to those of the superior race. We have but one word more to say. When Russia has as much said of her by her friends, as Lumholtz says of Australia, and others of India and America, then will every honest man and woman of Europe join in the indignation meetings and righteous protests against Russian atrocities. Until then, the best advice one can give to the English and the Americans is very, very old: judge not that ye be not judged. For how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own? H.P.B. Lucifer, February, 1889. A paradoxical world, open your ears when loud rumor speaks. I, from the Orient to the drooping West, making the wind my post horse, still unfold the acts commenced on this ball of earth, upon my tongue continual slanders ride. The which in every language I pronounce, stuffing the ears of men with false reports. I speak of peace, while covered enmity, under the smile of safety, wounds the world, and who but rumor, who but only one? Shakespeare. Why, one can smile, and murder while I smile, and cry content, to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears. And frame my face to all occasions if it we live in an age of prejudice, dissimulation, and paradox, wherein, like dry leaves caught in a whirlpool, some of us are tossed helpless, hither and thither, ever struggling between our honest convictions and fear of that cruelest of tyrants, public opinion. Yet, we move on in life as in a maelstrom formed of two conflicting currents, one rushing onward, the other repelling us downward, one making us cling desperately to what we believe to be right and true, and that we would fain carry out on the surface, the other knocking us off our feet, overpowering, and finally drowning us under the fierce, despotic wave of social propriety and that idiotic, arbitrary, and ever wool-gathering public opinion, based on slander and idle rumor. No person need in our modern day be honest, sincere, and righteous in order to curry favor or receive recognition as a man of worth. He need only be a successful hypocrite, or have become for no mortal reason he himself knows of popular. In our age, in the words of Mrs. Montague, while every vice is hid by hypocrisy, virtue is suspected to be hypocrisy. And the suspicion is looked upon as wisdom. Thus, no one seeming to know what to believe, and what to reject, the best means of becoming a paragon of every virtue on blind faith, is to acquire popularity. But how is popularity to be acquired? Very easily indeed. Howl with the wolves, pay homage to the favorite vices of the day, and reverence to mediocrities in public favor. Shut your eyes tight before any truth / unpalatable to the chief leaders of the social herd, and sit with them upon the dissenting minority. Bow low before vulgarity in power, and bray loud applause to the rising donkey who kicks a dying lion, now a fallen idol. Respect public prejudice and pander to its cant and hobbies, and soon you will yourself become popular. Behold, now is your time. No matter if you be a plunderer and murderer combined, you will be glorified all the same, furnished with an aureole of virtues, and allowed even a broader margin for impunity than contained in the truism of that Turkish proverb, which states that a thief not found out is honester than a bay. But now let a Socrates and Epictetus rolled into one suddenly become unpopular. That which will alone remain of him in the hazy mind of Dame Rumor is a pug nose and the body of a slave lacerated by the plying whip of his master. The twin sisters, Public Opinion and Mrs. Grundy, will soon forget their classics. Their female aspect, siding with Xanthippe, will charitably endeavor to unearth various good reasons for her outbreaks of passion in the shape of slops poured over the poor bald head, and will search as diligently for some hitherto unknown secret vices in the Greek sage. Their male aspect will see but a lashed body before its mental eye, and will soon end by joining the harmonious concert of society slander directed against the ghosts of the two philosophers. Result: Socrates Epictetus will emerge out of the ordeal as black as pitch, a dangerous object for any finger to approach. Henceforth, and for eons to come, the said object will have become unpopular. The same, in art, in politics, and even literature. A damned saint, an honorable villain, are in the present social order of things truth and fact have become unpalatable, and are ostracized. He who ventures to defend an unpopular character or an unpopular subject, risks to become himself anathema maranatha. The ways of society have contaminated all those who approach the threshold of civilized communities, and if we take the word and severe verdict of Lavater for it, there is no room in the world for one who is not prepared to become a full-blown hypocrite. For, he who by kindness and smooth attention and insinuate a hearty welcome to an unwelcome guest, is a hypocrite superior to 1,000 plain dealers, writes the eminent physiognomist. This would seem to settle the line of demarcation and to preclude so city, forever, from becoming a palace of truth. Owing to this, the world is perishing from spiritual starvation. Thousands and millions have turned their faces away from anthropomorphic ritualism. They believe no longer in a Parona/governor and ruler, yet this prevents them in no wise from attending every Sunday divine service, and professing during the week adherence to their respective churches. Other millions have plunged headlong into spiritualism, Christian and mental science or kindred mystic occupations, yet how few will confess their true opinions before a gathering of unbelievers. Most of the cultured men and women save rabid materialists are dying with the desire to fathom the mysteries of nature and even whether they be true or imaginary, the mysteries of the magicians of old. Even our weeklies and dailies confess to the past existence of a knowledge which has now become a closed book save for the very few. Which of them, however, is brave enough to speak civilly of the unpopular phenomena called spiritualistic, or dispassionately about Theosophy, or even to abstain from mocking remarks and insulting epithets? They will talk with every outward reverence of Elijah's chariot off fire, of the board and bed found by Jonah within the whale, and open their columns for large subscriptions to fit out scientifico-religious expeditions, for the purpose of fishing out from the Red Sea the drowned Pharaoh's golden toothpick, or in the desert, a fragment of the broken tables of stone. But they would not touch with a pair of tongs any fact, no matter how well proven, if vouchsafed to them by the most reliable man living who is connected with Theosophy or spiritualism. Why? Because Elijah flying away to heaven in his chariot is a biblical orthodox miracle, hence popular and a relevant subject, while a medium leviated to the ceiling is an unpopular fact, not even a miracle, but simply a phenomenon due to intermagnetic and psychophysiological and even physical causes. On one hand, gigantic pretensions to civilization and science, professions of holding but to what is demonstrated on strictly inductive methods of observation and experiment, a blind trust in physical science, that science which pooh-poohs and throws slur on metaphysics, and is yet honeycombed with working hypotheses all based upon speculations far beyond the region of sense, and often even of speculative thought itself, on the other hand, just as servile and apparently as blind an acceptation of that which orthodox science rejects with great scorn, namely, Pharaoh's toothpick, Elijah's chariot and the ichthyographic explorations of Jonah. No thought of the unfitness of things, of the absurdity, ever strikes any editor of a daily paper. He will place unhesitatingly, and side by side, the newest ape theory of a materialistic FRS and the latest discourse upon the quality of the apple which caused the fall of Adam. And he will add flattering editorial comments upon both lectures, as having an equal right to his respectful attention. Because, both are popular in their respective spheres. Yet, are all editors natural-born skeptics, and do not many of them show a decided leaning towards the mysteries of the archaic past, that which is the chief study of the Theosophical Society? The secrets of the pyramids, the rites of Isis, and the dread traditions of the Temple of Vulcan with their theories for transcendental speculation seem to have a decided attraction for the Evening Standard. Speaking some time since on the Egyptian mysteries, it said, "We know little even now of the beginnings of the ancient religions of Thebes and Memphis." All these idolatrous mysteries, it should also be remembered, were always kept profoundly secret, for the hieroglyphic writings were understood only by the initiated through all these ages. Plato, it is true, came to study from the Egyptian priests, Herodotus visited the pyramids, Pausanias and Strabo admired the characters which were sculptured so large upon their outer casing that he who ran could read them, but not one of these took the trouble to learn their meaning. They were one and all content to give currency, if not credence, to the marvelous tales which the Egyptian priests and people recounted and invented for the benefit of strangers. Herodotus and Plato, who were both initiates into the Egyptian mysteries, accused of believing in and giving currency to marvelous tales invented by the Egyptian priests, is a novel accusation. Herodotus and Plato refusing to take the trouble of learning the meaning of the hieroglyphs, is another. Of course, if both gave currency to tales, which neither an orthodox Christian, nor an orthodox materialist and scientist will endorse, how can an editor of a daily accept them as true? Nevertheless, the information given and the remarks indulged in, are wonderfully broad and in the main free from the usual prejudice. We transcribe a few paragraphs, to let the reader judge. It is an immemorial tradition that the Pyramid of Cheops communicated by subterranean passages with the great temple of Isis. The hints of the ancient writers as to the subterranean world which was actually excavated for the mysteries of Egyptian superstition, curiously agree. Like the source of the Nile itself, there is hardly any line of inquiry in Egyptian lore which does not end in mystery. The whole country seems to share with the Sphinx an air of inscrutable silence. Some of its secrets, the researches of Wilkinson, Rawlinson, Brugge, and Petrie have more or less fully revealed to us, but we shall never know much which lies concealed behind the veil of time. We can hardly hope even to realize the glories of Thebes in its prime, when it spread over a circuit of 30 miles, with the noble river flowing through it, and each quarter filled with palaces and temples. And the tyranny of the Ethiopian priests, at whose command kings laid down and died, will always remain one of the strangest enigmas in the whole problem of primitive priestcraft. Too, it was a tradition of the ancient world that the secret of immortality was to be found in Egypt, and that there, amongst the dark secrets of the antediluvian world which remained undeciphered, was the elixir of life. Deep, it was said, under the pyramids had for ages lain concealed the table of Emmer. On which, as the legend ran, Hermes had engraved before the flood, the secret of alchemy, and their weird associations justified the belief that still mightier wonders here remained hid. In the city of the dead to the north of Memphis, for instance, pyramid after pyramid rose for centuries towering above each other, and in the interior passages and chambers of the rock-cut tombs were pictured the mystic wisdom of the Egyptians in quaint symbols. A vast subterranean world, according to tradition, extended from the catacombs of Alexandria to Thebes' Valley of Kings, and this is surrounded with a whole wealth of marvelous story. These, perhaps, culminate in the ceremony of initiation into the religious mysteries of the pyramids. The identity of the legend has been curiously preserved through all ages, for it is only in minor details that the versions differ. The ceremonies were undoubtedly very terrible, one the more so since the literature of Theosophy, which is alone able to throw light on those mysteries, is boycotted and being unpopular can never hope to be appreciated. 2. Because these priests were real initiates having occult powers, while the kings mentioned died but for the world. They were the dead in life. The writer seems ignorant of the metaphorical ways of expression. The candidates were subjected to ordeals so frightful that many of them succumbed, and those who survived, not only shared the honors of the priesthood, but were looked upon as having risen from the dead. It was commonly believed, we are told, that they had descended into hell itself. They were, moreover, given draughts of the cups of Isis and Osiris, the waters of life and death, and clothed in the sacred robes of pure white linen, and on their heads the mystic symbol of initiation, the golden grasshopper. Instructed in the esoteric doctrines of the Sacred College of Memphis, it was only the candidates and priests who knew those galleries and shrines that extended under the site upon which the city stood and formed a subterranean counterpart of its mighty temples, and those lower crypts in which were preserved the 7 tables of stone, on which was written the knowledge of the antediluvian race, decrees of the stars from the beginning of time, the annals of a still earlier world, and all the marvelous secrets both of heaven and earth. And here too, according to mythological tradition, were the Isiac serpents which possessed mystic meanings at which we can now only vainly guess. When the monuments are silent, certainty is impossible in Egyptology, and in 30 centuries vestiges have been ruthlessly swept away which can never be replaced. Does not this read like a page from Isis Unveiled, or one of our theosophical writings minus their explanations? But why speak of 30 centuries, when the Egyptian zodiac on the ceiling of the Dendera temple shows 3 tropical years, or 75,000 solar years? But listen further, we can, in a sense, understand the awful grandeur of the Theban necropolis, and of the sepulchral chambers of Beni Hassan. The cost and toil devoted to the everlasting palaces of departed monarchs, the wonders of the pyramids themselves, as of the other royal tombs, the decoration of their walls, the embalmed bodies, all point to the conclusion that this huge subterranean world was made a complete antitype of the real world above. but whether or no it was a verity in this primitive cult that there was an actual renovation of life at the end of some vast cycle is lost in learned conjecture. Learned conjecture does not go far nowadays, being of a preeminently materialistic character, and limited somehow to the sun. But if the unpopularity of the Theosophical Society prevents much of which knowledge and the mysteries of the same earlier races have been explained in the Secret Doctrine, a work, however untouched by the English dailies, as unorthodox and unscientific a jumble, truly. The statements of its members from being heard, if we ignore Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, the Theosophist, etc., full of facts, most of which are as well authenticated by references to classical writers and the contemporaries of the mysteries in Egypt and Greece, as any statement made by modern Egyptologists. Why should not the writer on the Egyptian mysteries turn to Origen and even to the Ennead for a positive answer to this particular question? This dogma of the return of the soul or the ego after a period of 1000 or 1500 years into a new body, a theosophical teaching now, was professed as a religious truth from the highest antiquity. Voltaire wrote on the subject of these 1000 years of post-mortem duration as follows: this opinion about resurrection, rather, reincarnation, after 10 centuries, passed to the Greeks, the disciples of the Egyptians, and to the Romans, their initiates only, disciples of the Greeks. One finds it in the VLTH book of the Age Ennead, which is but a description of the mysteries of Isis and of Ceres Eleucina, has omnis ubimil rotum volvere per annos, lithium ad fluvium dies evocat agmine magno /silicet im mores, supera ut convexa revisant. This opinion passed from the pagan Greeks and Romans to Christians, even in our century, though disfigured by sectarianism, for it is the origin of the millennium. No pagan, even of the lower classes, believed that the soul would return into its old body. Cultured Christians do, since the day of the resurrection of all flesh is a universal dogma, and since the millenarians wait for the second advent of Christ on earth when he will reign for 1,000 years. All such articles as the above quoted are the paradoxes of the age, and show ingrained prejudices and preconceptions. Neither the very conservative and orthodox editor of the Standard, nor yet the very radical and infidel editors of many a London paper, will give fair or even dispassionate hearing to any theosophical writer. Can any good come out of Nazareth? The Pharisees and Sadducees of old are credited with asking. Can anything but twaddle come from theosophical quarters? Repeat the modern followers of Kant and materialism. Of course not. We are so very unpopular. Besides which, Theosophists who have written the most upon those subjects at which, in the words of the Evening Standard, we can now only vainly guess are regarded by Mrs. Grundy's herds as the black sheep of Christian cultured centers, having had access to Eastern secret works, hitherto concealed from the world of the profane. The said Theosophists had means of studying and of ascertaining the value and real meaning of the marvelous secrets both of heaven and earth, and thus of disinterring many of the vestiges now seemingly lost to the world of students. But what matters that? How can one so little in odor of sanctity with the majorities, a living embodiment of every vice and sin, according to most charitable souls, be credited with knowing anything? Nor does the possibility of such charges being merely the fruit of malice and slander, and therefore entitled to lie sub judice, nor simple logic, ever trouble their dreams or have any voice in the question. Oh no! But has the idea ever crossed their minds that on that principle the works of him who was proclaimed, the greatest, wisest, meanest of mankind ought also to become unpopular, and Baconian philosophy be at once shunned and boycotted? In our paradoxical age, as we now learn, the worth of a literary production has to be judged, not on its own intrinsic merits, but according to the private character, the shape of the nose, and the popularity or unpopularity of the writer thereof. Let us give an example, by quoting a favorite remark made by some bitter opponent of the secret doctrine. It is the reply given the other day to a theosophist who urged a would-be scientist and supposed Assyriologist to read said work. Well, he said, I grant you there may be in it a few facts valuable to students of antiquity and to scientific speculation. But who can have the patience to read 1,500 pages of dreary metaphysical twaddle for the sake of discovering in it a few facts, however valuable? O imitators sarvum picus! And yet how joyfully you would set to work, sparing neither time, labor, nor money, to extract 2 or 3 ounces of gold from tons of quartz and useless alluvial soil. Thus, we find the civilized world and its humanities ever unfair, ever enforcing one law for the wealthy and the mighty, and another law for the poor and the uninfluential. Society, politics, commerce, literature, art, and sciences, religion and ethics, all are full of paradoxes, contradictions, injustice, selfishness, and unreliability. Might has become right, elsewhere than in colonies, and for the detriment of black men. Wealth leads to impunity, poverty to condemnation even by the law, for the impecunious having no means of paying lawyers are debarred from their natural right to appeal to the courts for redress. Hint, even privately, that a person notorious for having acquired his wealth by plunder and oppression, or unfair play on the stock exchange, is a thief, and the law to which he will appeal will ruin you with damages and court expenses and imprison you into the bargain for libel, for the greater the truth, the greater the libel. But let that wealthy thief slander your character publicly, accuse you falsely of breaking all the 10 commandments, and if you are in the slightest degree unpopular, an infidel, or too radical in your views, no matter how honorable and honest you may be, yet you will have to swallow the defamation, and let it get root in the minds of people, or go to law and risk many hundreds or even thousands out of your pocket and get 1 farthing damages. What chance has an infidel in the sight of a bigoted, ignorant jury? Behold those rich speculators who arrange bogus quotations on the stock exchange for shares which they wish to foist upon an innocent public that makes for everything whose price is rising. And look at that poor clerk, whose passion for gambling, which the example of those same wealthy capitalists has fired if caught in some small embezzlement, the righteous indignation of the rich capitalists knows no hounds. They ostracize even one of their own confreres because he has been so indiscreet as to be found out in dealings with the unhappy wretch. Again, what country boasts more of Christian charity, and its code of honor, than Old England? Yeah, you have soldiers and champions of freedom, and they take out the deadly machine guns of your latest purveyor of death and blow to fragments a stockade in Solima, with its defending mob of half-armed savages, of poor niggers, because you hear that they perchance may molest your camps. Yet it is to that self-same continent you send your almighty fleets, into which you pour your soldiers, putting on the hypocritical mask of saving from slavery these very black men whom you have just blown into the air. What country, the world over, has so many philanthropic societies, charitable institutions, and generous donors as England has? And where, on the face of the earth, is the city which contains more misery, vice, and starvation, than London, the queen of wealthy metropoles? Hideous poverty, filth, and rags glare from behind every corner, and Carlyle was right in saying that the poor law was an anodyne, not a remedy. Blessed are the poor, said your man God. Avaunt the ragged, starving beggar from our West End streets, you shout, helped by your police force, and yet you call yourselves his humble followers. It is the indifference and contempt of the higher for the lower classes which has generated and bred in the latter that virus which has now grown in them into self-contempt, brutal indifference and cynicism, thus transforming a human species into the wild and soulless animals which fill the Whitechapel dens. Mighty are thy powers, most evidently, O Christian civilization. But has not our theosophical fraternity escaped the infection of this paradoxical age? Alas, no. How often the cry against the entrance fee was heard among the wealthiest theosophists. Many of these were Freemasons, who belonged to both institutions. Their lodges in Theosophy they had paid fees upon entering the former, surpassing 10 times the modest £1, paid for their diploma on becoming Theosophists. They had to pay as widows' sons, a large price for every paltry jewel conferred upon them as a distinction, and had always to keep their hands in their pockets ready to spend large sums for paraphernalia, gorgeous banquets with rich viands and costly wines. This diminished in no way their reverence for Freemasonry. But that which is good for the Masonic goose is not fit sauce for the Theosophical gander. How often was the hapless president-founder of our society, Colhs Alcott, taunted with selling Theosophy for £1 per head. He, who worked and toiled from January 1 to December 31 for 10 years under the broiling sun of India, and managed out of that wretched pound of the entrance fee and a few donations to keep up the headquarters, to establish free schools and finally to build and open a library at Adyar of rare Sanskrit works, how often was he condemned, criticized, misjudged, and his best motives misinterpreted? Well, our critics must now be satisfied. Not only the payment of the entrance fee but even that of 2 shillings yearly, expected from our fellows to help in paying the expenses of the anniversary meetings, at the headquarters at Madras, this large sum of 2 shillings, by the by, having never been sent in but by a very limited number of Theosophists, all this is now abolished on December 27 last. The rules were completely recast, the entrance fee and annual dues were abolished, writes a Theosophist Stoic from Adyar. We are on a purely voluntary contribution footing. Now if our members don't give, we starve and shut up, that's all. A brave and praiseworthy reform, but rather a dangerous experiment. The B Lodge of the TS in London never had an entrance fee from its beginning, 18 months ago, and the results are that the whole burden of its expenses has fallen upon half a dozen of devoted and determined Theosophists. This last anniversary financial report, at Adyar, has moreover brought to light some curious facts and paradoxical incongruities in the bosom of the Theosophical Society at large. For years our Christian and kind friends, the Anglo-Indian missionaries, had set on foot and kept rolling the fantastic legend about the personal greediness and venality of the founders. The disproportionately large number of members, who, on account of their poverty had been exonerated from any entrance fees, was ignored, and never taken into account. Our devotion to the cause, it was urged, was a sham. We were wolves in sheep's clothing, bent on making money by psychologizing and deceiving those poor benighted heathen and the credulous infidels of Europe and America. Figures are there, it was added, and the 100,000 Theosophists, with which we were credited, represented £100,000, etc., etc. Well, the day of reckoning has come, and as it is printed in the general report of the Theosophist, we may just mention it as a paradox in the region of Theosophy. The financial report includes a summary of all our receipts from donations and initiation fees, since the beginning of our arrival in India, i.e. February 1879, or just 10 years. The total is 89,140 rupees, or about £6,600. Of the Rs 54,000 of donations, what are the large sums received by the Theosophical, parent, society in the respective countries? Here they are, in India. Rupees 40,000 in Europe, 7,000 in America, 7,001. Total 47,700 rupees or £3,600. 40 Theosophy and Public Opinion Vitae Infra Theosophical Activities, the President Founder's Address. The two greedy founders having given out of their own pockets during these years almost as much, in the result there remain two impecunious beggars, practically two/opera Theosophists, but we are all proud of our poverty and do not regret either our labor or any sacrifices made to further the noble cause we have pledged ourselves to serve. The figures are simply published as one more proof in our defense and a superb evidence of the paradoxes to be entered to the credit of our traducers and slanderers. Lucifer, December, 1888. Is denunciation a duty? Condemn no man in his absence, and when forced to reprove, do so to his face, but gently, and in words full of charity and compassion. For the human heart is like the kusuli plant, it opens its cup to the sweet morning dew, and closes it before a heavy shower of rain. Buddhist precept: judge not, that ye be not judged. Christian aphorism: not a few of our most earnest Theosophists feel themselves, we are sorry to hear, between the horns of a dilemma. Small causes will at times produce great results. There are those who would jest under the cruelest operation, and remain cool while having a leg amputated, who would yet raise a storm and renounce their rightful place in the kingdom of heaven if, to preserve it, they had to keep silent when somebody treads on their corns. In the 13th number of Lucifer, September, page 63, a paper on the meaning of a pledge was published. Out of the 7 articles, 6 only were given out, which constitute the entire pledge. The 1st, 4th, 5th, and especially the 6th, require great moral strength of character, and iron will added to much unselfishness, quick readiness for renunciation and even self-sacrifice, to carry out such a covenant. Yet scores of Theosophists have cheerfully signed this solemn promise to work for the good of humanity, forgetful of self, without one word of protest save on one point. Strange to say, it is Rule the Third which in almost every case makes the applicant hesitate and show the white feather. Ante tubam trepidat. The best and kindest of them feels alarmed, and he is as overawed before the blast of the trumpet of that third clause, as though he dreaded for himself the fate of the walls of Jericho. What is then this terrible pledge, to carry out which seems to be above the strength of the average mortal? Simply this: I pledge myself never to listen without protest to any evil thing spoken of a brother Theosophist, and to abstain from condemning others. To practice this golden rule seems quite easy. To listen without protest to evil said of anyone is an action which has been despised ever since the remotest days of paganism. To hear an open slander is a curse, but not to find an answer is a worse. Says Ovid. For one thing, perhaps, as pointedly remarked by Juvenal, because slander, that worst of poisons, ever finds an easy entrance to ignoble wines. And because in antiquity, few liked to pass for such minds. But now, in fact, the duty of defending a fellow man stung by a poisonous tongue during his absence, and to abstain, in general, from condemning others, is the very life and soul of practical Theosophy. For such action is the handmaiden who conducts one into the narrow path of the higher life, that life which leads to the goal we all crave to attain. Mercy, Charity, and Hope are the 3 goddesses who preside over that life. To abstain from condemning our fellow beings is the tacit assertion of the presence in us of the 3 divine sisters. To condemn on hearsay shows their absence. Listen not to a tale-bearer or slanderer, says Socrates. For, as he discovereth of the secrets of others, so he will thine in turn. Nor is it difficult to avoid slandermongers. Where there is no demand, supply will very soon cease. When people refrain from evil hearing, then evil speakers will refrain from evil talking, says a proverb. To condemn is to glorify oneself over the man one condemns. Pharisees of every nation have been constantly doing it since the evolution of intolerant religions. Shall we do as they? We may be told, perhaps, that we ourselves are the first to break the ethical law we are upholding. That our theosophical periodicals are full of denunciations, and Lucifer lowers his torch to throw light on every evil, to the best of his ability. We reply, this is quite another thing. We denounce indignantly systems and organizations, evils, social and religious cant. Above all, we abstain from denouncing persons. The latter are the children of their century, the victims of their environment and of the spirit of the age. To condemn and dishonor a man instead of pitying and trying to help him, because, being born in a community of lepers he is a leper himself, is like cursing a room because it is dark, instead of quietly lighting a candle to disperse the gloom. 111 Deeds are doubled with an evil word, nor can a general evil be avoided or removed. By doing evil oneself and choosing a scapegoat for the atonement of the sins of a whole community. Hence, we denounce these communities, not their units. We point out the rottenness of our boasted civilization, indicate the pernicious systems of education which lead to it, and show the fatal effects of these on the masses. Nor are we more partial to ourselves. ready to lay down our life any day for Theosophy, that great cause of the universal brotherhood for which we live and breathe, and willing to shield, if need be, every Theosophist with our own body, we yet denounce as openly and as virulently the distortion of the original lines upon which the Theosophical Society was primarily built, and the gradual loosening and undermining of the original system by the sophistry of many of its highest officers. We bear our karma for our lack of humility during the early days of the Theosophical Society, for our favorite aphorism, "See, how these Christians love each other," has now to be paraphrased daily, and almost hourly, into, "Behold, how our Theosophists love each other." And we tremble at the thought that, unless many of our ways and customs, in the Theosophical Society at large, are amended or done away with, Lucifer will one day have to expose many a blot on our own scutcheon. Worship of self, uncharitableness, and sacrificing to one's personal vanity the welfare of other Theosophists more fiercely than it has ever denounced the various shams and abuses of power in state churches and modern society. Nevertheless, there are Theosophists, who, forgetting the beam in their own eye, seriously believe it their duty to denounce every mote they perceive in the eye of their neighbor. Thus, one of our most estimable, hard-working, and noble-minded members writes, with regard to the said third clause, "The pledge binds the taker never to speak evil of anyone." But I believe that there are occasions when severe denunciation is a duty to truth. There are cases of treachery, falsehood, rascality in private life which should be denounced by those who are certain of them, and there are cases in public life of venality and debasement which good citizens are bound to lash unsparingly. Theosophic culture would not be a boon to the world if it enforced unmanliness, weakness, flabbiness of moral texture. We are sincerely sorry to find a most worthy brother holding such mistaken views. First of all, poor is that Theosophic culture which fails to transform simply a good citizen of his own native country into a good citizen of the world. A true Theosophist must be a cosmopolitan in his heart. He must embrace mankind, the whole of humanity, in his philanthropic feelings. It is higher and far nobler to be one of those who love their fellow men, without distinction of race, creed, caste, or color, than to be merely a good patriot, or still less, a partisan to meet one measure for all, is holier and more divine than to help one's country in its private ambition of aggrandizement, strife, or bloody wars in the name of greediness and selfishness. Severe denunciation is a duty to truth. It is, on condition, however, that one should denounce and fight against the root of evil and not expend one's fury by knocking down the irresponsible blossoms of its plant. The wise horticulturist uproots the parasitic herbs, and will hardly lose time in using his garden shears to cut off the heads off the poisonous weeds. If a Theosophist happens to be a public officer, a judge or magistrate, a barrister or even a preacher, it is then, of course, his duty to his country, his conscience, and those who put their trust in him, to denounce severely every case of treachery, falsehood, and rascality even in private life, but nota bene only if he is appealed to and called to exercise his legal authority, not otherwise. This is neither speaking evil nor condemning, but truly working for humanity, seeking to preserve society, which is a portion of it, from being imposed upon, and protecting the property of the citizens entrusted to their care as public officers, from being recklessly taken away. But even then the Theosophist may assert himself in the magistrate, and show his mercy by repeating after Shakespeare's severe judge, "I show it most of all when I show justice." But what has a working member of the Theosophical Society, independent of any public function or office, and who is neither judge, public prosecutor, nor preacher, to do with the misdeeds of his neighbors? If a member of the TS is found guilty of one of the above enumerated or some still worse crime, and if another member becomes possessed of irrefutable evidence to that effect, it may become his painful duty to bring the same under the notice of the council of his branch. Our society has to be protected, as also its numerous members. This, again, would only be simple justice. A natural and truthful statement of facts cannot be regarded as evil speaking or as a condemnation of one's brother. Between this, however, and deliberate backbiting there is a wide chasm. Clause 3 concerns only those who, being in no way responsible for their neighbor's actions or walk in life, will yet judge and condemn them on every opportunity. And in such case it becomes slander and evil speaking. This is how we understand the clause in question, nor do we believe that by enforcing it theosophic culture enforces unmanliness, weakness, or flabbiness of moral texture, but the reverse. True courage has naught to do, we trust, with denunciation, and there is little manliness in criticizing and condemning one's fellow men behind their backs, whether for wrongs done to others or injury to ourselves. Shall we regard the unparalleled virtues inculcated by Gautama the Buddha, or the Jesus of the Gospels as unmanliness? Then the ethics preached by the former, that moral code which Professor Max Muller, Verneuf, and even Barthelemy St. Hilaire have unanimously pronounced the most perfect which the world has ever known, must be no better than meaningless words, and the Sermon on the Mount had better never have been written at all. Does our correspondent regard the teaching of non-resistance to evil, kindness to all creatures, and the sacrifice of one's own self for the good of others as weakness or unmanliness? Are the commands, "Judge not that ye be not judged," and "Put back thy sword, for they who take the sword shall perish with the sword," to be viewed as flabbiness of moral texture or as the voice of karma? But our correspondent is not alone in his way of thinking. Many are the men and women, good, charitable, self-sacrificing and trustworthy in every other respect, and who accept unhesitatingly every other clause of the pledge, who feel uneasy and almost tremble before this special article. But why? The answer is easy, simply because they fear an unconscious, to them, almost unavoidable perjury. The moral of the fable and its conclusion are suggestive. It is a direct blow in the case of Christian education and our civilized modern society in all its circles and in every Christian land. So deep has this moral cancer the habit of speaking uncharitably of our neighbor and brother at every opportunity eaten into the heart of all the classes of society, from the lowest to the very highest, that it has led the best of its members to feel diffident of their tongues. They dare not trust themselves to abstain from condemning others from mere force of habit. This is quite an ominous sign of the times. Indeed, most of us, of whatever nationality, are born and brought up in a thick atmosphere of gossip, uncharitable criticism and wholesale condemnation. Our education in this direction begins in the nursery, where the head nurse hates the governess, the latter hates the mistress, and the servants, regardless of the presence of baby and the children, grumble incessantly against the masters, find fault with each other, and pass impudent remarks on every visitor. The same training follows us in the classroom, whether at home or at a public school. It reaches its apex of ethical development during the years of our education and practical religious instruction. We are soaked through and through with the conviction that, though ourselves born in sin and total depravity, our religion is the only one to save us from eternal damnation, while the rest of mankind is predestined from the depths of eternity to inextinguishable hell fires. We are taught that slander of every other people's gods and religion is a sign of reverence for our own idols, and is a meritorious action. The Lord God, Himself, the personal absolute, is impressed upon our young plastic minds as ever backbiting and condemning those He created, as cursing the stiff-necked Jew and tempting the Gentile. For years the minds of young Protestants are periodically enriched with the choicest curses from the Commination Service in their prayer books, or the denouncing of God's anger and judgments against sinners, besides eternal condemnation for most creatures, and from his birth the young Roman Catholic constantly hears threats of curse and excommunication by his church. It is in the Bible and Church of England prayer books that boys and girls of all classes learn of the existence of vices, the mention of which, in the works of Zola, falls under the ban of law as immoral and depraving, but to the enumeration and the cursing of which in the churches, young and old are made to say Amen, after the minister of the meek and humble Jesus. The latter says, "Swear what? Curse not, condemn not, but love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate and persecute you." But the canon of the church and the clergyman tell them, not at all. There are crimes and vices for which ye affirm with your own mouths the curse of God to be due. Vide combination service. What wonder that later in life, Christians piously try to emulate God and the priest, since their ears are still ringing with, "Cursed be he that removeth his neighbor's landmark," and "Cursed be he who does this, that or the other, even he that putteth his trust in man," and with God's judgment and condemnations. They judge and condemn right and left, indulging in wholesale slander and comminuting on their own account. Do they forget that in the last curse the anathema against adulterers and drunkards, idolaters and extortionists, the unmerciful and slanderers, are included? And that by having joined in the solemn amen after this last Christian thunderbolt, they have affirmed with their own mouths the curse of God to be due on their own sinful heads? But this seems to trouble our society slanderers very little, for no sooner are the religiously brought up children of church-going people off their school benches, than they are taken in hand by those who preceded them, coached for their final examination in that school for scandal, called the world, by older and more experienced tongues, to pass Master of Arts in the science ol cant and combination. A respectable member of society has but to join a religious congregation, to become a churchwarden or lady patroness. Who shall dare deny that in our age, modern society in its general aspect has become a vast arena for such moral murders, performed between 2 cups of 5 o'clock tea and amid merry jests and laughter? Society is now more than ever a kind of international shambles wherein, under the waving banners of drawing room and church Christianity and the cultured tittle-tattle of the world, each becomes in turn, as soon as his back is turned, the sacrificial victim, the sin offering for atonement, whose singed flesh smells savory in the nostrils of Mrs. Grundy. Let us pray, brethren, and render thanks to the God of Abraham and of Isaac that we no longer live in the days of cruel Nero. And, oh, let us feel grateful that we no longer live in danger of being ushered into the arena of the Colosseum, to die there a comparatively quick death under the claws of the hungry wild beasts. It is the boast of Christianity that our ways and customs have been wonderfully softened under the beneficent shadow of the cross. Yet we have but to step into a modern drawing room to find a symbolical representation, true to life, of the same wild beasts feasting on, and gloating over, the mangled carcasses of their best friends. Look at those graceful and as ferocious great cats, who with sweet smiles and an innocent eye sharpen their rose-colored claws preparatory to playing at mouse and cat. Woe to the poor mouse fastened upon by those proud society felids. The mouse will be made to bleed for years before being permitted to bleed to death. The victims will have to undergo unheard of moral martyrdom, to learn through papers and friends that they have been guilty at one or another time of life of each and all the vices and crimes enumerated in the combination service, until, to avoid further persecution, the said mice themselves turn into ferocious society cats, and make other mice tremble in their turn. Which of the two arenas is preferable, my brethren, that of the old pagan or that of Christian lands? Addison had not words of contempt sufficiently strong to rebuke this society gossip of the worldly canes of both sexes. How frequently, he exclaims, is the honesty and integrity of a man disposed of by a smile or a shrug? How many good and generous actions have been sunk into oblivion by a distrustful look, or stamped with the imputation of proceeding from bad motives, by a mysterious and seasonable whisper. Look how large a portion of chastity is sent out of the world by distant hints nodded away, and cruelly winked into suspicion by the envy of those who are past all temptation of it themselves. How often does the reputation of a helpless creature bleed by a report which the party who is at the pains to propagate it beholds with much pity and fellow feeling that she is heartily sorry for it, hopes in God it is not true. From Addison we pass to Sterne's treatment of the same subject. He seems to continue this picture by saying, so fruitful is slander in variety of expedients to satiate as well as to disguise itself, that if those smoother weapons cut so sore, what shall we say of open and unblushing scandal, subjected to no caution, tied down to no restraints? If the one, like an arrow shot in the dark, does, nevertheless, so much secret mischief, this, like pestilence, which rages at noonday, sweeps all before it, leveling without distinction the good and the bad, 1,000 fall beside it, and 10,000 on its right hand, they fall, so rent and torn in this tender part of them, so unmercifully butchered, as sometimes never to recover from either the wounds or the anguish of heart which they have occasioned. Such are the results of slander, and from the standpoint of karma, many such cases amount to more than murder in hot blood. Therefore, those who want to lead the higher life among the working fellows of the Theosophical Society must bind themselves by this solemn pledge, or remain droning members. It is not to the latter that these pages are addressed, nor would they feel interested in that question, nor is it an advice offered to the FSTS at large. For the pledge under discussion is taken only by those fellows who begin to be referred in our circles of lodges as the working members of the TS. All others, that is to say those fellows who prefer to remain ornamental, and belong to the mutual admiration groups, or those who, having joined out of mere curiosity, have, without severing their connection with the society, quietly dropped off, or those, again, who have preserved only a skin-deep interest, if any, a lukewarm sympathy. For the movement and such constitute the majority in England need burden themselves with no such pledge. Having been for years the Greek chorus in the busy drama enacted, now known as the Theosophical Society, they prefer remaining as they are. The chorus, considering its numbers, has only, as in the past, to look on at what takes place in the action of the dramatis personae, and it is only required to express occasionally its sentiments by repeating the closing gems from the monologues of the actors, or remain silent at their option. Philosophers of a day, as Carlyle calls them, they neither desire, nor are they desired to apply. Therefore, even were these lines to meet their eye, they are respectfully begged to remember that what is said does not refer to either of the above enumerated classes of fellows. Most of them have joined the society as they would have bought a guinea book attracted by the novelty of the binding. They opened it, and, after glancing over contents and title, motto, and dedication, they have put it away on a back shelf, and thought of it no more. They have a right to the volume, by virtue of their purchase, but would refer to it no more than they would to an antiquated piece of furniture relegated to the lumber room, because the seat of it is not comfortable enough, or is out of proportion with their moral and intellectual size. 100 to 1 these members will not even see Lucifer, for it has now become a matter of theosophical statistics, that more than 2/3 of its subscribers are non-theosophists. Nor are the elder brothers of Lucifer the Madras Theosophist, the New York Path, the French Lotus, nor even the marvelously cheap and international T.P.S., of 7, Duke Street, Adelphi, any luckier than we are. Like all prophets, they are not without honor, save in their own countries, and their voices in the fields of theosophy are truly the voice of one crying in the wilderness. This is no exaggeration. Among the respective subscribers of those various theosophical periodicals, the members of the TS, whose organs they are, and for whose sole benefit they were started, their editors, managers, and the whole staff of constant contributors working gratis, and paying furthermore out of their own generally meager pockets, printers, publishers, and occasional contributors, are on the average 15%. This is also a sign of the times, and shows the difference between the working and the resting theosophists. We must not close without once more addressing the former. Who of these will undertake to maintain that Clause 3 is not a fundamental principle of the code of ethics which ought to guide every theosophist aspiring to become one in reality? For such a large body of men and women, composed of the most heterogeneous nationalities, characters, creeds, and ways of thinking, furnishing for this very reason such easy pretexts for disputes and strife, ought not this clause to become part and parcel of the obligation of each member working or ornamental who joins the theosophical movement? We think so, and leave it to the future consideration of the representatives of the General Council, who meet at the next anniversary at Adyar. in a society with pretensions to an exalted system of ethics, the essence of all previous ethical codes, which confesses openly its aspirations to emulate and put to shame by its practical example and ways of living the followers of every religion, such a pledge constitutes the sine qua non of the success of that society. In a gathering where near the noisome nettle blooms the rose, and where fierce thorns are more plentiful than sweet blossoms, a pledge of such a nature is the soul salvation. No ethics as a science of mutual duties, whether social, religious, or philosophical from man to man, can be called complete or consistent unless such a rule is enforced. Not only this, but if we would not have our society become de facto and de jure a gigantic sham parading under its banner of universal brotherhood, we ought to follow every time the breaking of this law of laws, by the expulsion of the slanderer. No honest man, still less a theosophist, can disregard these lines of Horace: he that shall rail against his absent friends, or hears them scandalized, and not defends, tells tales, and brings his friends in disesteem, that man's a knave, be sure beware of him. Theosophical Literature is Unveiled, a master key to the mysteries of ancient and modern science and theology, by H. P. Blavatsky, Vol. I Science, XLV plus 628 pages. Vol. 2 Theology, 4 plus 640 pp. This exhaustive study of religion and science was /6 me. Blavatsky's first presentation of Theosophy to the modern world. It is reproduced in photographic facsimile of the original edition, 1877, 2 volumes bound in one, cloth, complete with general index and supplementary topical index. American edition, The Secret Doctrine, The Synthesis of Science, Religion, and Philosophy, by H. P. Blavatsky, Volume 1, Cosmogenesis, Slady I plus 676 pages. Volume 2, Anthropogenesis, 14 plus 798 pages. A systematic development of theosophical teachings on cosmogenesis, anthropogenesis, symbolism, comparative religion, with extensive comparisons of ancient wisdom with scientific conceptions. Facsimile of original, 1888, edition, 2 volumes bound in one, cloth, complete with index, XXX pp. American edition, index to The Secret Doctrine, all volume and page reference to the original edition, London 1888, and to the photographic facsimile reproduction, listed above. Reprint X plus 172 pages. American edition, The Key to Theosophy, an exposition, in question and answer, of the ethics, science, and philosophy of Theosophy, by H. P. Blavatsky. Reprint of original edition, 1889, 15 plus 367 pages. Indian edition, The Voice of the Silence, by H. P. Blavatsky, a blank verse rendition of chosen fragments from the Book of the Golden Precepts, belonging to the Contemplative or Mahayana, Yogacarya, school. Reprint of the original edition, 1889, 4 plus 79 pages, cloth. Indian edition, Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, by H. P. Blavatsky. Reprint of the original, 1923, XXIV plus 149 pages, cloth. American edition, A Modern Panarion, by H. P. Blavatsky, a collection of fugitive fragments. American edition, The Ocean of Theosophy, by William Q. Judge, a comprehensive text on the theosophical philosophy by a co-founder of the theosophical movement, widely used as a text in study classes. Reprint of original edition, 1893, 15 plus 182 pages. Indian edition, The Bhagavad Gita, rendered into English by William Q. Judge, an ancient dialogue of philosophical religion from the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. Cloth, 18 plus 133 pages. Indian edition, Notes on the Bhagavad Gita, by W. Q. Judge. Indian edition, Letters That Have Helped Me, by W. Q. Judge. American edition, and shorter Indian edition, Forum Answers, by William Q. Judge. Reprints from the Theosophical Forum. American edition, The Friendly Philosopher, compiled from Letters and Talks, by Robert Crosby, 415 pages, cloth. American edition, Universal Theosophy, by Robert Crosby, Indian edition 5 years of Theosophy essays selected from the Theosophist. American edition order from Theosophy Company, Mysore, Private Limited, 4, Sir Krishna Rao Road, Bangalore 560,004 India.